Good day, and welcome to the AFP webinar, Legacy Giving Building Blocks, a simple approach to attracting long-term support. At this point, I'd like to introduce your presenters for today. First, we have Kayla Brick, who is an adjunct professor of nonprofit management and a nationally known proponent of donor-centered outcomes-based legacy giving. He's a graduate of Middlebury College and a Vermont Law School, and also a former fundraiser for Dartmouth, University of California, and Sierra Club. He has trained hundreds of charity staff and volunteers, spoken at dozens of conferences, and helps organizations build successful legacy giving programs. Also with us is Greg Lassonde, who is a legacy giving specialist. He serves as an advisory board member of Legacy Giving. He runs a consulting practice in the San Francisco Bay Area and has nearly 3 decades of fund development experience working with a wide variety of nonprofit agencies. He founded the Northern California Planned Giving Council's Basics course and is a board member and the immediate past treasurer of AFP's Golden Gate chapter. Gentlemen, welcome, and the podium is all yours.
Colin, thank you very much. We really appreciate your help, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today. My good friend and colleague, and Greg, is in Oakland, California. I'm coming to you from Baltimore, Maryland. And for those of you who are in the Mid-Atlantic and New England states, we're experiencing quite a storm, so hope you are all warm, safe, and have safe travels later this afternoon. What I'd like to do is start by giving you a quick overview of the presentation. We're going to be breaking at a couple of points to take your questions and comments, and look forward to hearing your thoughts on this topic. We want to start by basically giving you a quick overview of what we believe legacy giving is and some representative examples. I'll talk to you about why we think this should be a part of every organization's fundraising program, give you our approach and thinking about this topic, offer some reasons for why this type of fundraising is particularly important to most organizations, offer some thoughts and ideas about what we see as some of the challenges that many organizations face in this area, talk a little bit about what motivates people to create a legacy gift for their favorite cause or causes, talk about some of the approaches that we use in helping organizations think about building programs, and quickly reference a readiness checklist that you might use to sort of see where your organization is, and finish with what we hope are some observations about how you might measure success and work with your organization to think about how to approach this topic. So with that, we'll get started. And really want to offer 2 very, very simple definitions of legacy giving. One of the challenges that Greg and I find is, and we like to use the term jokingly, that so much of planned giving in our experience is technobabble. It gets so caught up in various vehicles and instruments that we really are, unfortunately, I think, often leave our friends and supporters uncertain of what it is we're really talking about. So we think it's really important to start by describing what it is that we're asking their help on in a way that's pretty straightforward. And we hope both these representative examples achieve that. One is to convey one's values through creation of a future gift to charity. Another way of putting it might be a foresighted action to strengthen a favorite cause. And clearly there's lots of wonderful and meaningful ways to express this, but again, our suggestion and notation would be that wherever possible we want to use language that our friends and supporters can understand. So let's look at some examples of legacy gifts, and they include a beneficiary form designation, which we'll come back and talk a little bit more about in just a couple minutes. A will, obviously, a trust. There are a variety of life income arrangements, and we also include endowment gifts. I know endowment gifts, as many of you know, can be made in outright fashion. Because endowments provide long-term support to organization, we generally encourage organizations to consider an endowment gift a form of legacy giving. Perhaps most importantly, legacy gifts can be created by any individual at any point in their life. Now, there are complicated legacy gifts, and here are just a few representative examples. And we're referring to them as complicated legacy gifts really from the perspective that in order to create one or more of these types of gifts, you generally want to have the help and assistance of an attorney, accountant, and or financial planner. It's generally not a type of gift that you would want to encourage your supporters to create on their own. They can also be complicated in the sense that depending on how the particular gift instrument is created, what kind of assets are being used to fund it, there may be some other legal, technical, or other complexities associated with the gifts. Again, all very powerful forms of legacy gifts, but all examples that typically require the help of assistance of other professionals. And we also want to highlight and really encourage you to think about emphasizing as much of your time on a number of what we call simple and easy legacy gifts, and we refer to them as beneficiary form designation. And again, you see here savings accounts, checking accounts, stocks or bonds, IRA or pension plans, annuities, life insurance policies are all representative examples of assets that can be gifted to charitable organizations, and they can be gifted to an organization by filling out what's called a beneficiary form designation, which is typically on part of the paperwork that you receive when you have one of these particular assets. And it's a very, very simple and straightforward process to actually complete a beneficiary form. One of the reasons that we particularly encourage organizations to think about promoting this type of philanthropy is, number one, typically it does not require the assistance of a professional advisor, i.e. an attorney or accountant or financial planner. Secondly, it takes just about a few minutes to actually complete the form, and perhaps best of all, because in our experience we find that often people put off the process of creating their estate plan. We feel and we see typically that by encouraging individuals to think about creating this kind of gift, it's something they can actually typically do in a very short period of time. It doesn't take a lot of thought or effort, and furthermore, we would argue it's often a great feeder system, and by that I mean by encouraging people to start with their first legacy gift through creation of a beneficiary form designation. When in the future they get around to actually creating their estate plan or revising their estate plan, because they have already, in a sense, created some type of beneficiary form designation for your organization, they already have your organization in mind and can then move on to a broader plan. So we think it's a great entry point. We also think it's a very wonderful form of giving for many individuals who you may not categorize as really being major donors or prospects. Since almost all of us have banking or accounts, checking or savings accounts, many of us have IRA and pension plans, and certainly a lot of us have life insurance, they all become wonderful vehicles for many, many people to consider as a form of legacy giving. I want to quickly take you through some of the common beneficiary form elements just to familiarize you with them if you haven't seen one before. I should note that they vary in design depending on the financial institution, whether it's an insurance company, your bank, or trust company. They all have sort of their own nuances, if you will, in terms of how they present and design the form. But almost all beneficiary forms have these common elements. And I'm going to take you through what the elements are and then perhaps offer a strategy for how you can use them to help your friends and supporters thinking about creating this kind of legacy gift. Typically on the beneficiary form, you will find a space for the name of the owner of that particular account, their address and social security number. There's typically a space for them to designate a primary beneficiary or beneficiaries, as well as their address and typically their percentage interest. And in thinking about a primary beneficiary, what's happening is that by using the beneficiary form, an individual is saying, upon my death, I want all or some percentage of this particular asset, in other words, my checking account or my savings account, whatever the particular asset might be, I want it to go to John Smith or Mary Jane or whoever the person might be, or alternatively, they can use that primary beneficiary space to designate a favorite charity or charities. There is typically also a contingent beneficiary space on the form, and that's so that if for whatever reason, in the case of they've designated a friend or family member as the primary beneficiary of that asset, if they should predecease the individual, then the contingent beneficiary space allows the individual to name a successor beneficiary, if you will. Most forms have a right to revoke beneficiary clause, and really all that's doing is saying that the person who owns that account reserves the right to change their mind at any time. There's usually also spaces for the date that they've made the designation and a signature of the account owner saying this is what I want to do. In the case of married couples, it's not unusual that you need to get the consent or agreement of the spouse that they, in fact, are in agreement that the gift will be designated for somebody else. And finally, there's typically a notary public space on the form, and that's just to certify that the person, in fact, that this is their intention. Now, at most banks and trust companies, many of the personnel who work at those institutions are, in fact, notary public. In my experience, it really takes no more than 3 or 4 minutes to fill out the form. So again, it's a powerful and easy way for many of your organization's friends and supporters to begin walking down the path of thinking about providing a future gift for your organization. Now, my recommendation, and I'll ask Greg to jump in here with additional thoughts he may have, is that you might start by approaching local banks or trust companies or even insurance agents in your immediate service area to see if they would be willing to provide you with some representative example beneficiary forms from their institution. Again, every financial institution's beneficiary form is going to vary somewhat, but having 2 or 3, maybe 4 representative examples might be a helpful tool as you sit down, meet, and talk with your friends and supporters about creating this kind of gift. Greg, any other thoughts? Okay, we'll move on. A tremendous revenue opportunity. One of the reasons that we really encourage organizations to really invest time, energy, and resources in building a legacy giving program is that the reality is that while most Americans, and for our Canadian friends, these numbers tend to hold true in Canada from what we gather, most Americans are, in fact, generous during their lifetime. Yet the sad and unfortunate reality is that fewer than 1 in 10 actually creates a legacy gift. Why? Because most people have never been asked. And if we leave you with one key point today, we would suggest to you that more importantly than anything else, we really need to raise and heighten the awareness of our friends and supporters about the power of giving back to strengthen and support organizations they care about. One of the arguments we would make to you is that it really starts by helping our friends and supporters first understand that they have the choice to do so, that this is among the many ways in which they can help your organization, and that the power and benefit of creating a legacy gift for your organization is that it will help others in your community for many, many years to come. Now, our thinking about legacy giving is that we really would suggest that it's about setting a number of key objectives in mind, and I'm going to just sort of quickly pull these up. I'm going to say first and foremost, we really recommend that your organization think about projecting the notion that you are a good steward of your resources, so thinking about sustainability and appropriate resource management. If we're going to talk with our friends and supporters about creating legacy gifts to support our organization, we think it's very important that we're prepared to articulate how those gifts might help our organization, so identifying and describing some specific objectives and outcomes that your organization has. As in any form of fundraising, but we think particularly in importance related to legacy giving, absolutely critical important to engage a wide swath of individuals in your organization, including certainly your volunteers, supporters, and staff. For those of you who are directors of development, you know that often you're carrying a heavy burden and you may have 8, 9, 10 different objectives that you're trying to achieve at any given time. By getting your board members and other volunteers and staff involved in this process, it really enables everyone to get behind the cause of creating long-term support for your organization. As with other forms of philanthropy, absolutely about building relationships with people, and we would suggest by extension it's not about the technobabble of plan giving. It's not about selling people and all the benefits of the various ways in which they can save taxes and what have you. It's really about creating relationships with individuals who you know care about your organization and mission. Stewardship is an essential part of legacy giving, as it is in any other area of fundraising. So thinking about how you're going to celebrate your legacy donors over time. Again, the notion that you are going to emphasize and communicate how this form of giving impacts your mission. And finally, we really encourage you to sort of take these themes and develop a simple plan that you're consistently applying over time. We'll pause here for a moment if there are any questions or comments.
Caleb, I'm not connected, so you should be looking at the questions and asking them. I'm trying to come up to speed on the technical side.
Okay. I don't see any questions at this point, but we will be responding to questions as we move through the program, and certainly welcome your thoughts and ideas.
Well, Caleb, this is Colin, and there is one question that has come in. Yeah. How do we handle instances when donors switch annuity providers and do not notify it was just the why?
So if I understand the question, and the person who's posed this question, if I don't have it right, please clarify. But my understanding is that what you're asking is what happens when someone, say, changes assets. So maybe they have a life insurance policy with one company, and then they move and create another life insurance policy. That's a great question, and I'm going to say the reality of it is that any time someone creates a new asset or switches to a new asset, we want to make sure that they're filling out that beneficiary form. So if, for example, you had someone who had a life insurance policy with the ABC Life Insurance Company, and then they let that policy lapse and they took out a new policy with the DEF Life Insurance Company, they would again need to fill out or complete that beneficiary form. Now, what I will say is because of the very real simplicity and ease of filling out the beneficiary form, and because it really doesn't take much time, my suggestion would be that someone who's been through the process probably will not have any difficulty in filling out a successive beneficiary form. But your question and point is well taken, and again, the notion being that to the extent that we're promoting this idea, we really want to encourage folks to be periodically reviewing their assets and thinking about their long-term commitment to our organizations.
Caleb, I think the bigger response here might be that people should pay attention to having good stewardship relationships. And you may not be informed if they change companies, but at some point you may catch up with that person, and having a good relationship will solve the problem.
Okay, so why should your organization be thinking about encouraging legacy giving? What are some of the reasons that you might use to convince your senior staff or board members and others about why spend time in this area? And a question that Greg and I certainly get all the time is, my executive director, my board chair really wants me to focus on outright gifts or the annual fund. We need that money today. We just don't have time, or we recognize that legacy giving represents a tremendous revenue potential, but we really have to be focused here and now. And fortunately, because of a great deal of really wonderful research that's been done in the field of gift planning over the last several years, we now actually have a number of reasons why we really encourage organizations to think not just about the strategic importance of legacy gifts, to your organization long term, but also the real value and impact that legacy giving can have on your current fundraising program. So here are just a few. First of all, we want to start with a notion, and again, apologies for the bad humor, but at the end of the day, there are some people who have lots of toys and think when they die, they can take them with them. And the reality is, there is no such thing as a U-Haul behind a hearse. And that was a comment made in a class I had in law school by an estates professor who really wanted to point out that the reality, almost everyone dies with an estate of some value. Now, why would we start there? Well, in part because one of the areas that we really would encourage you to think about is that everyone within your audience, or almost everyone within your audience, is a potential legacy gift prospect. So unlike major giving, where you're really going through the process of identifying those supporters with the greatest capacity to make an outright gift, legacy giving is a form of philanthropy that applies to everyone. So sort of not unlike your annual fund, you really want to think about communicating the importance of giving back to everyone in your audience. So what are the strategic importance? Well, as I already noted, the reality is that almost everyone is a prospect for a legacy gift. So the benefit of broad education is that there are opportunities to reach many, many potential legacy donors. For most people, it's the largest gift they make, and when you think about it, it really makes sense. I suspect that for many of you, you have otherwise very dedicated volunteers and supporters in your organization who, because of their circumstances, may not be able to support you with a large gift to the annual fund or to make a major gift to support your efforts. But at death, they're really in a position to make a big impact. And as Greg, I think, will agree with me, many of the more significant gifts that we've seen charities receive over the years came from individuals who were otherwise of relatively modest means, who didn't have the ability during life to make a major gift, but at death were in a great position to give back a large gift of support to an organization or organizations they cared about. So again, the power of legacy giving is that not only is everyone a prospect, but again, for most people, it's going to be the largest gift they can make.
And Caleb, another way to say that is most people are unable to make a major gift in their lifetime, so they do that through their will or trust.
Thanks, Greg. The other thing is that though legacy giving tends to be a long-term return, it tends to be a very low cost of investment. So for a relatively modest investment of time and resources, you can really have a fabulous return to your organization. Research in recent years has shown, and I want to say thanks to the Stelter Company, who I think was behind this study, they were able to determine that the reality is that individuals who create legacy gifts tend to make much larger gifts to your annual fund. Now, I know when I got into the fundraising profession over 20 years ago, the mythology in the field was that somehow annual giving and legacy giving was in competition, and that you'd never want to talk to an annual fund donor about also making a legacy gift. The research shows just the opposite, that in fact someone who's gone through the process of creating a legacy gift for your organization is much more likely to support your annual fund and at a much higher level than a non-legacy donor. Now, when you think about it, it makes sense. Someone has gone through the exercise of thinking about which organization or organizations are important to them and who they might want to support after their lifetime. I would argue to you that someone who chooses to create a legacy gift for an organization is what I would call the ultimate faith donor. So there's really a powerful opportunity to engage them during their lifetime in providing enhanced support for what your organization does. As we talked about earlier, only a small percentage of donors have actually been asked to create a legacy gift. So there's a tremendous opportunity here for organizations to grow their revenue streams and to think about reaching out to many, many of their friends and supporters who haven't even given thought or consideration to creating this type of gift. Now, going back to the earlier point about larger annual fund gifts, I want to just highlight that for those of you who might be working for organizations where you're feeling pressure to raise current dollars, an argument about investing time in legacy giving is that it can actually help your annual fund. As we talked about earlier, there are, in fact, a wide variety of ways to create legacy gifts, and as we noted with the beneficiary form designation, many of them are very, very easy to create. It is the only form of philanthropic revenue that increases during recessions. And this is historically true. If you look back 60, 70 years at different economic downturns and recessions in American history, the one form of philanthropic revenue that has always increased, even during those difficult times, have been gifts from land gifts, wills, and other forms of legacy giving. So beginning a program now is not only a way, again, to enhance your relationship with your friends and supporters, to think strategically about how you can grow support for your annual fund, but it's also building security for your organization long term. And as I suspect many of you have read in the popular press over the last decade or so, we are now in the early stages of what is considered to be the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth that we've ever seen. So it is a particularly opportune time for organizations to be thinking about, talking about, and planning for the future, and promoting legacy giving as a means to strengthen and support their missions and organizations for many years to come. Now, we often find when we talk to organizations, they'll say, well, yes, Greg, Caleb, those are great arguments. You know, we understand that legacy giving offers tremendous potential revenue for organization, but the reality is we're going to start a program when hell freezes over. And the reason is often that there's all kinds of challenges or obstacles that they find or perceive are standing in their way or their ability to move forward with creating a legacy giving program. And we want to offer just a few examples of obstacles that we often hear folks talking about. There may be others as well, but these are certainly some of the most common obstacles we hear about. Sometimes it's because organizational leaders are uncertain why legacy giving is important. And that may be an issue of educating your executive director, your board, about what legacy giving is and strategically why it's important to your organization short-term, mid-term, and long-term. Often it's because the subject matter is perceived to be too difficult. And for any of you who have attended various plan giving conferences and training sessions over time where your head was spinning at the end of the day or after several days because you were being asked to memorize all kinds of different vehicles and tax regulations and codes and strategies and so forth, we would argue that that doesn't represent success. And it doesn't represent success in part because if we're not talking to our friends and supporters in language they understand, they're not going to move forward in creating a gift of this kind. I will admit with some embarrassment that early in my fundraising career, when I was all so self-impressed and self-absorbed in my newfound knowledge of all the various plan giving vehicles, that it literally took me a couple of years of realizing that each time I met with a potential supporter to share my knowledge about all these wonderful vehicles, that the look that I was getting was akin to sort of a deer in the headlights look. And that the reality is that most prospects couldn't care less about the vehicles. What they want to know is, what impact could my philanthropy have on this organization? So we really would encourage you to think about moving away from all the vehicles and instead talk about outcomes. And our argument would be that any fundraiser who's good at what he or she does is already qualified to be able to talk about why their organization is important and what impact it makes. Often there's a concern that it takes a lot of staff time, and we would argue that in reality, it really all depends on how much time and effort your organization wants to commit to building a legacy giving program. We certainly see and have experienced that organizations can build successful programs if they're willing to spend as little as a half a day or a day a month of time to engaging and cultivating their friends and supporters and talking about the future. So it is absolutely untrue that it has to take a lot of time. Now, clearly, if you really want to build a program and you're having a lot of success, you might ultimately decide that you want to dedicate more staff and volunteer resources to the effort, but it is absolutely not a necessity. Often we hear that there's concern that, well, launching a plan giving program is going to cost a lot of money. We're going to have to create a big budget. And instead, we would really suggest that it really comes down to, do you have staff and or volunteers who are willing to talk with others about the future of your organization and the notion of giving back? And if your organization has existing publications or communication opportunities, to think about how you can use those vehicles, whether it's a newsletter or a magazine or your website and or other venues, to include messages about the importance of giving back to support your organization long term. So it need not require that you spend a lot of money. As I think I alluded to earlier, one of the challenges that we perceive we face in this area of philanthropy is that because the way in which we've talked about plan giving for more than 2 decades, we make it so complicated that ultimately a lot of our friends and supporters really perceive that this is a form of giving that only applies to the wealthy. In fact, there's research that shows that even using the term bequest, to most people, a bequest is something that a wealthy person does, whereas an overwhelming majority of people understand when you say, remembering my favorite charity in your will, the overwhelming majority of people understand that. So understanding the language we use is important, and recognizing that part of our challenge is really helping our friends and supporters that really anybody can create this type of gift, and it's not solely designed for the wealthy. Often an obstacle is the question of, well, I get it. You know, I'd really like to build a program. I'd like to think about how we can develop this revenue stream over time, but I just don't think my senior staff or my board will get behind this or understand this. And again, I think simplicity is the key. If you can lay out a case for strategically why legacy giving really is an important and an appropriate form of philanthropy for everyone within your audience, at least to consider. Secondly, that there are very easy ways to do it. And thirdly, that if they can understand how legacy giving relates to other parts of your philanthropy or fundraising program, whether it's donor stewardship or strengthening your annual fund or learning more about your donors and many other reasons, that there are a number of very, very good reasons why this should be part of your overall resource development effort. So again, it need not be complex. We think often it's just that staff and board members really just aren't fundamentally aware of what legacy giving is or why it's important. So it's taking some time to help educate them to the impact it can have. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about some of the reasons why people are motivated to create legacy gifts. Often, and quite simply, it's just simply to express appreciation to a charity that helped them or served them in some way. They're often motivated to create a legacy gift because they want to support and sustain organizations they care about. It may be a reflection of their value system, cultural, ethical, or religious, the notion of giving back. They perceive that it meets a need of the community, and they're interested and engaged in the idea of taking part of what they've accumulated over their lifetime and investing it back in their community through organizations that are making a difference. I've encountered certainly many donors who feel that's an appropriate use of at least some of the wealth that they've accumulated over a lifetime. On occasions, it can be because they want to memorialize themselves or another loved one, or honor someone who's made a difference in their life. And by creating a legacy gift, it's a great way to acknowledge that person and the impact they've had. Some people use it and view it as a form of example to others, and like the idea that by creating a legacy gift, it might spur future generations to think about the notions of giving back. For some, it's about creating something of beauty, and the example that I always love to cite here, for those of you who have ever visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, when you first enter the museum, you enter the Grand Hall, and before you ascend the main staircase into the museum, on either side of the staircase, there are two absolutely beautiful floral arrangements, and they were provided by a donor who believed that even as people were coming to the museum to experience just beautiful works of art, that so too might they have the tactile experience of encountering a beautiful bouquet, or arrangement, I should say, of flowers. So they created an endowment to ensure that in perpetuity there will be beautiful floral arrangements greeting visitors to the museum. So again, just sometimes it's because someone wants to make a statement or do something of beauty. And finally, and I will quickly argue, of least importance, a reason that people create legacy gifts is to accomplish planning and financial benefits. Now, the reason that I cite this particular idea last is that, in fact, donor surveys have consistently shown that this is the least important reason why most people think about creating a legacy gift. That in fact it's all those other reasons that we've talked about that prompt someone to think about the notion of giving back. Now, having said that, because there are potential planning and financial benefits to creating a legacy gift, that certainly becomes a consideration. But as Greg and I have found over the years, many organizations, in our opinion, make the mistake of promoting legacy giving, and they lead with the argument that you should create a legacy gift because it offers all kinds of financial and planning benefits. And our argument to all of you would be that we're missing far too many people in our audience who, frankly, that's not going to be the reason to motivate them. They want the argument, they want the case, they want to understand the ideas behind how creating a legacy gift can really make a difference. And to the extent that you are spending time and getting to know your friends and supporters, I suspect that many of you who are working with donors on an ongoing basis recognize that a number of these issues are obviously reasons why they support your organization through gifts to the annual fund or other forms of outright gifts. Again, similar reasons for why they might think about creating a legacy gift.
One more point on this is that you want to make sure on your website that tax considerations are always in context. You don't lead with them. They're probably not in the middle of your arguments. They're toward the bottom, visible, but in context.
And we're going to take a break here if there are questions or thoughts that people would like to share.
Caleb, I'm now having access to the Q&A, and I think we can handle all the questions at the end. There's nothing that's immediately on topic.
Okay, terrific. Well, we'll keep moving on. And again, we really welcome your thoughts and observations. And if there are issues that Greg or I may comment on, we'd love to do so. So now what I want to do is I want to shift and talk a little bit about, okay, so you've heard our argument for what legacy giving is and why it's important, and in a sense the strategic value to your organization. Now we actually want to identify some specific, what we call building blocks ideas that we really see as sort of fundamental steps in thinking about how you go about either building a legacy giving program, or in the case that perhaps you already have a legacy giving program, but maybe it's not as strong as you'd like it to be, how do you go back and sort of take a look at it and think about ways in which you can sort of strengthen your effort? And again, I want to quickly say this is all very basic, all very common sense, probably very obvious to most people on the call, but we think we hope it's helpful in terms of just providing sort of a reminder of sort of some of the fundamentals. And we would start with a notion of what we call mission, legacy, legacy giving and endowment. And by that we really mean, let's first understand, why is it important to our organization? And all too frequently what Greg and I see is that, those of us in fundraising, we, in a sense, we already understand why a particular form of philanthropy is important, but occasionally we make the mistake of not helping our volunteers or other staff understand its value to the organization. And by that I mean, they certainly understand and appreciate the revenue that gets raised. Clearly they welcome that and help support the programs. But what I mean is really the broader context of how they understand how it's accomplished, what difference it makes, what motivations donors have to support organizations, some of those broader issues. And so we start by saying that it's important, going back to the notion of getting your fellow staff and board members and other volunteers engaged in understanding what legacy giving is, so that you have their help and support in building a program. It is really important to start by creating and answering this first issue, which is how might this make a difference in an organization? And to that extent, we would suggest that raises building block 2, which is the notion that we would really strongly recommend that you consider creating a simple case for support. Now, many of you, I suspect, have been through capital campaigns, so you understand the premise of a case statement, an articulated description and document that describes and outlines your goals and objectives and how you're planning to use the resources to support your organization over time. Our argument to you would be that we need a similar type of expression and articulation for legacy giving. And again, I see very, very few organizations actually taking the time to actually explain how legacy gifts will make a difference to their organization. It's almost like they jump ahead to, well, of course you must know that it's going to help us, so let me tell you about the ways in which you can create a legacy gift. We would argue that we have to start by first helping our friends and supporters understand what legacy giving is, how it will help our organization, and to the extent possible, are there some representative examples that we might articulate so that a potential donor can understand what impact their gift might have. And we know from extensive donor research, and not just in the world of plan giving or legacy giving, but across philanthropy, that donors are increasingly saying to us, we want more information. We want to have an understanding of what impact our gift will have. We want to know what difference our giving will make. So again, we would argue that it's really essential to build a simple case for support that outlines how legacy gifts will help your organization. Thirdly, and we've talked about this earlier, we think it's important to go through the process of engaging your board and staff leadership in helping them understand and get behind the idea of building a program. As most of you know, the average tenure of a director of development is relatively short, so many of us move on to new jobs. Legacy giving is a long-term proposition, and so for those organizations that are really going to commit the time, energy, and resources to attract long-term support, it's really essential that non-fundraising staff understand the role, that what legacy giving is and the role that it can play in an organization. And I would go so far as to say that one of the primary duties of a board of directors or board of trustees is stewardship of the organization. And to be good stewards of an organization, you should always be mindful and thinking about the future. To the extent that you're mindful and thinking about the future, legacy giving becomes a great vehicle to help others join with you in supporting the organization long term. So engaging your leadership and your board in discussions about legacy giving and the role that it plays is not only important in terms of lending and offering you the support and help that you'll need in building the program, but it's also important to ensure that you're moving towards an organizational awareness where giving back to the organization long term is part of your organizational culture. When we think about prospects, and I suspect many of you know that there are a number of services out there that will do rating and screening of your database to prospectively help you identify candidates for giving, and there are some services that suggest that they will actually help you identify plan giving prospects. Greg and I take perhaps a contrarian view, and in part because our argument would be that because so relatively few people are currently creating legacy gifts, frankly, we're not convinced that many of the rating and screening products and opportunities, if you will, that are out there necessarily have the benefit of helping us understand how we get the 93% of our potential audience to think about creating a legacy gift who haven't already done so. So our argument would be that it's really important to just start about thinking about who are your best supporters. And by that I mean who's most engaged in your mission, who's been a long-time volunteer, who's shown support because they've been a consistent contributor to your annual fund for many years, who has a vested interest in the long-term success of your organization. Again, while we would argue that everyone is a potential prospect for a legacy gift, those who we think are probably the best candidates to begin with are those who already have demonstrated to you that they have a real interest in your organization and its mission. So looking at longtime volunteers, looking at individuals who've been consistent supporters, looking at individuals who've made a difference in the history or life of your organization, we would put them in the top tier. And going through the exercise of beginning to create just a basic pool of prospects who fit within that category, again, would be an important building block in thinking about how you grow your program. Fifth, stewardship, and as we all know in any form of fundraising, building, cultivating, enhancing our relationships with our friends and supporters is important, not just because it's an important, appropriate, and ethical thing to do, but because at the end of the day, the reality is that when we pay attention to those donors who provide us support, they're much more likely to continue their support over time. So too would we make the argument that with legacy giving, it isn't good enough to talk with someone and convince them about creating a legacy gift, that we really want to continue to build that relationship with them over time. And we want to do that for a number of reasons. We want to do it because, again, number one, it's the right thing to do, but we also want to do it because there's always the potential that they might consider increasing the size or number of legacy gifts that they've created for your organization. And as we talked about earlier in terms of the annual fund, legacy donors are more likely to make contributions to your annual fund. So by paying attention to our legacy donors, engaging in good stewardship practices, we're really strengthening our other fundraising efforts. Communications and marketing is the next, and we're going to say essential piece of building or strengthening a legacy giving effort. As I've alluded to several times previously, one of the challenges that we find in this area of philanthropy is that most people, frankly, don't really know what we're talking about. So our ability to think about how we're going to use the communication tools and vehicles that are available to us, our website, newsletter, e-newsletters, events, meetings, programs, activities, direct mail, every form of communication that you have presents a potential opportunity to talk about the future of your organization, and by extension, to remind your audience that giving back to the organization is a way to have lasting impact. So thinking about your communications and marketing efforts is really critically important, and in part because our challenge and our opportunity here is to help educate our audience about a subject that for many people they've never really given any thought to. So looking again at how you communicate with your audience, what tools and vehicles you use, and thinking about how might you include messages or descriptions of the notion of long-term support, how can you use those vehicles to help make the case? I would suggest to you that one of the most powerful ways of encouraging awareness legacy giving is by profiling individuals who've already created a legacy gift, or perhaps created a legacy gift years ago and they've died and the gift has come in and helped the organization in some way. Almost all of us like to read stories of other people, and often reading a story of a donor, what prompted or motivated them to create a gift, how that gift helped the organization, is really a terrific and easy way to help other individuals say, gee, that person's not unlike me, and look what they've done. I could do something as well. So really encourage you to think about the power of stories as you think about communicating and marketing your legacy giving effort. And finally, because we really are talking about an effort that's going to require a commitment over time, not necessarily a lot of time, but consistency in approach, we would really encourage you to think about building just a very simple program plan that identifies the elements that I've just described so that on an annual basis or perhaps more frequently, you have the ability to say, how are we doing? Who are our prospects? Are our leaders involved? Is our case still strong and compelling for why we're looking for long-term support? How are we doing in getting the messaging out? How are we thanking, acknowledging, and attending to the needs of our best friends and supporters? All fundamental sort of basic issues and questions that we would sort of see on a checklist for any type of fundraising, but so too very true with legacy giving. So these are, again, the 7 just basic approaches that we would recommend that you think about as you think about the process of building or strengthening your effort. Now, again, perhaps to help you maybe flesh this out a little bit, we've actually created a very simple, what we call readiness checklist, which looks at these issues and poses some questions. So in the mission, legacy giving, and endowment area, why do we have interest in generating long-term support? And if we're looking to build an endowment program, how might we describe some of our objectives and what policies we put in place to help promote it? When we think about our case, does our case actually describe what our needs are and perhaps offer a vision for where we're headed as an organization? Have we in fact not just talked about but actually physically created a document that we can use that explains why legacy giving is important to our organization, both internally and externally? When we think about leadership, are our staff and volunteers ready to promote legacy giving? And I always joke that you ask the average person if they want to fundraise, and people are typically diving under tables. So I'm not suggesting that everyone is going to suddenly raise their hand and say, oh, goodness, I want to be a solicitor. I want to go out and ask others for legacy gifts. What I really mean here is the notion of, are they on board? Do they understand the importance of legacy giving? And are they ready to get behind the thinking and planning for how to share this message with others? And secondly, to the extent possible, have board members and staff made their own legacy commitment, or are they willing to do so? And I will say for all of you who work for organizations that as part of your benefits package, many of you may receive what I would describe as an employer-paid life insurance policy. One of the simplest and easiest ways that you yourself can become a legacy donor is to go down to your Human Resources Department, ask for a copy of the beneficiary form designation for your employer-paid life insurance policy, and make the choice to designate part or all of it to your organization. So that as you're out talking with others, you can say, look, it was very simple, very easy. I, too, have made the decision to create a legacy gift to support our organization. And as we all know, in other areas of fundraising, when we've taken the action and first step ourselves, our argument is much more compelling when we're encouraging others to do likewise. Prospects, what criteria are you using for identifying your prospects? And again, I suggested a couple: long-term volunteers, folks who've been consistent donors to your annual fund. You may have others. There might be particular activities of the organization that your organization has that demonstrates a level of commitment that provides a good benchmark or measure, if you will, for looking at categories of prospects. But in the end, how are we thinking about who our best prospects are to talk about? And then, are we prepared and are we thinking about having regular discussions with our supporters about legacy giving? So when we go out to talk to somebody about making a gift to the annual fund or making a major or capital gift, are we also prepared to talk about the future of the organization and to plant the seed about the idea of giving back through a legacy gift?
Caleb, I like to ask organizations how they define qualified prospects or prospects. And what I've come up with in many conversations is that a qualified prospect is someone who's identified themselves. But how do you know who to go after to begin with? A prospect or a suspect or whatever name you're going to use. And I would say that a prospect is anyone with a long-term and a heart connection to your organization. You can figure out who the long-term prospects are by looking at your database and saying that anyone who's given for 5 years or longer would be someone that should be considered being approached. But you can't know who the people are with a heart connection unless you get out and talk with them one-on-one. And that's where most legacy gifts are left on the table. Organizations, whether the largest in the country or in Canada, or if they're smaller organizations, if they're engaged in legacy giving, will follow up with people who they can measure through long-term, through the database, through the length of the relationship or how many gifts they've made, but that one-on-one side, as we've been emphasizing throughout this entire presentation, is so important. You can't measure that heart connection any other way but in person.
Greg, thanks for that. And I may just add to that, if there are folks on this call who, for whatever reason are working for an organization where maybe your database isn't quite where you want it to be, and it would even be difficult to assess or determine who your long-term supporters or volunteers have been, I'm going to suggest to you that the best way to build your legacy giving program is just to set the goal that I'm going to talk to 2 people this month or 3 people this month or 10 people this year or whatever it might be. And if you're a little bit nervous or uncomfortable about how to approach it, I would suggest that it's really as simple as saying, hey, I've been thinking about the future of our organization. We're thinking about how we can support and sustain what we do for many, many years to come. And one of the ways that we can do that is by talking with friends and supporters who care about the organization and asking them if they might think about creating a legacy gift to help us out long term. Now, because we're just in the early stages of thinking about building this program, I'm not ready to ask you specifically to make that gift today, but what I'd like to do is get your thoughts and feedback to the idea. If I were to ask you about the possibility of making a gift of this kind, what issues or criteria might you use in determining whether you would make a gift to support us? What information might you want or need that would be helpful to you in the process of thinking about it? And when you think about the idea that we want to talk with lots of people about this process, what do you think, or what are your thoughts about how we might describe our need? Or are there thoughts or strategies that you have for how we might engage others? If this is something that you might think about, are there others who you might be willing to talk with about this idea? So it's really about starting a conversation, and as Greg noted, engaging them one-on-one just to plant the seed and get them thinking about how they really do have an opportunity to make a difference. Stewardship, and again, stewardship is familiar to everyone here, but just a couple of quick questions is, are board and staff members routinely involved in stewardship activities? And I know I've certainly worked for organizations where, stewardship was assigned exclusively to the development department or the development office, but how are we moving towards an organizational culture where board members and other staff recognize that their participation in the exercise of saying, thank you, we appreciate it, is an essential part of building a strong resource development program. And again, with legacy giving as well. So the ability to get others involved in the process of acknowledging and appreciating our support is critically important. Secondly, how are we thinking about our strategies for fostering and enhancing relationships with legacy donors? So yes, we may be thinking about, events or activities. We might be thinking about creating, for example, a particular legacy donor society to recognize and acknowledge individuals who created legacy gifts. But beyond that, what else are we doing? Are we using the occasion of our annual dinner or events or programs to take just a few minutes to say thank you to everyone in the room who's provided for the organization long term? Are we regularly talking when we talk about the future of our organization and our goals and objectives? Are we, as part of that conversation, saying, and we want to thank those who've thought about our future and have made plans to help us get there? Often it's very, very simple things, but we need to do it with some consistency. So stepping back and sort of thinking about how we can get everyone with the organization to think about the process of talking about and acknowledging the role that individuals play in strengthening our organizations long term, really, really essential. When we think about communications and marketing, Greg and I generally recommend that you start by putting together just a basic list. What are the variety of ways that our organization employs to communicate with our audience? And we've cited certainly several: websites, newsletters, e-newsletters, direct mail, what have you. But what Greg and I consistently find is that often there are vehicles for communication that aren't immediately apparent in a fundraising context. So I worked with a community hospital several years ago that had what I would describe as one of those health styles newsletter that I suspect many people on this call have received. Some of you have probably been involved in actually producing. It was a newsletter that promoted smoking cessation, yoga classes, and birthing classes, and what have you. And I asked the board members who were involved in getting this publication how they might use it to promote support for the hospital. And there's, oh gosh, we wouldn't think about using it for that. And I said, well, I'm not talking about money. I'm not talking about the fact that you want to put dollar figures in the brochure, but you have told me that this is one of your most popular publications and it reaches a very large and dedicated audience. So why not include messaging in your Health Styles newsletter about where you're headed as a community hospital and what your plans are? So again, I would encourage you to think about the wide array of ways in which your organization communicates, and having created a list or inventory of those opportunities, how might you use those opportunities to promote discussions of the future, your goals, your plans, and yes, legacy giving as a objective for helping support the organization long term. Secondly, as you've created a list or inventory of your communication vehicles, now how might you create a plan to ensure that over time you're including and inserting messaging in those various communication vehicles or forums over time? And the reason we recommend this is that often the timeline for creating a publication or revising a publication can be several weeks or often months. And so being opportunistic when your organization is looking to change or revise or create a new publication, having a plan in place is a great way to be prepared for including that future-oriented messaging in all the communications and marketing that you do. And then finally, talking about the program plan, have we created a plan that will help focus and support and sustain our efforts in this area? And I would also add, Greg and I have found critically important, again, this notion of board leadership and ownership. Has our board reviewed our goals and objectives, and are we setting as a goal for all of ourselves that we're going to ask the board on a periodic basis just to take a few minutes even out of a board meeting to talk about long-term revenue and what impact it will have on our organization, so that the board is continually educated and reminded of this important area of philanthropy. So I'm going to finish with what we hope will lay out for you some essential goals and then how you think about measuring success. But we really see at the heart of every successful legacy giving program, there really are three essential goals that we would really encourage you to think about and be prepared to address. Number one, are we clear and do we understand why legacy giving is important? Do we have a willingness to talk with others? And are we committed to the idea that we are on an ongoing basis going to celebrate legacy gifts and the individuals who create them? Now, we would argue that every organization that can start by answering each of these issues in the affirmative is ready to raise long-term support. But it's critically important that everyone understands what it is and why it's important, that there's a willingness to talk openly about the future of the organization and why long-term support is essential, and that we're not going to shy away or be foolish in not saying thank you and recognizing others who have taken the position and made the decision to support us long-term. And then measuring success, and we think here too, often in the world of plan giving, we think we've made the measures far too complicated. Ironically, most organizations that have sophisticated plan giving programs spend a disproportionate amount of time pursuing the most complex gifts: charitable remainder trusts, gift annuities, pooled income funds. They spend the bulk of their time pursuing and promoting those types of gifts. And yet the irony is that more than 80% of the revenue that organizations receive comes not from those complex gifts, but from simple bequests, beneficiary form designation, and other simple revocable gifts. So the irony is that many of the organizations with the most sophisticated programs spend all their time in the area that offers the least return. So in terms of thinking about measuring success, we would offer you three simple measures. Number one, we suggest that you set a goal for how many people are we planning or looking to speak with this year or this month or whatever the measurement period is about this idea of the future of the organization and how they can play a role in helping us long term. For your organization, it might be 5 people a year. it might be 50 people a year, it might be 1,000 people a year. There's no right or wrong. Rather, it's making the commitment that on an ongoing basis, we're going to set aside some time to talk to friends and supporters about this important area of philanthropy, and that our measure, one measure, if you will, to see how we're doing, is to see how we set the goal for how many people we aspire to talk to each year, and then how many people did we actually get out and talk to about this or talk with on the phone about this. Secondly, we think that it's important to think about creating, where possible, a legacy donor society, i.e. a mechanism to celebrate and recognize individuals who've actually created legacy gifts. And if you already have a legacy society in place, or if you don't have one, we would encourage you to think about creating one. And then again, as a second form of measurement, we would encourage you to think about setting some kind of goal for how many people you want to recruit to join your legacy society each year. And again, for each organization, it's going to be a potentially wildly different number. But again, it becomes an indice or measure of how are you doing. And then finally, and we're going to suggest in some ways this is really perhaps the most important measure, and this tends to be a midterm or long-term measure, but has our organization gotten to the point where we view legacy giving not just as, oh yeah, that's another job for the development director, but do they view legacy giving as an organizational priority? And as we talked about earlier, to the extent that you have invested or will invest time in helping your senior staff and your board in particular understand the potential and the strategic value of legacy giving, it's therefore that much easier to help them join with you in seeing it as an organizational priority. In moving towards the goal or objective that you want to create an organizational culture that sees legacy giving as a natural extension of someone's commitment to your organization. So again, these would be the three measures that we really think at the end of the day are most important. Now, in the world of planned giving, there's a lot of talk about, well, how do we count planned gifts? How do we figure out what they're worth? And as I think Greg will attest, the reality is that most people, the vast majority of individuals, will likely not share with you the details or the specifics of their legacy gifts. I will tell you that when I was working for the Sierra Club now almost 20 years ago, I looked at an 11-year period to see what the average size bequest we received, and this is now again 20 years ago, the average bequest we received was roughly $70,000. So a significant gift, and as I mentioned earlier, many of those gifts came from people of relatively modest means. So for my way of thinking, for Greg's way of thinking, it's really about participation. It's really an annual fund approach. We want to get as many people as possible to be thinking about that. That's really the measure we want to be looking for.
Well, Caleb, that was really great. I was experiencing technical difficulties, but we've overcome those. We've got about 20 minutes now for questions and answers. We have about a dozen questions, and two-thirds of those are actually on beneficiary form designations. We'll get to those questions, but I'm going to take questions that have broader implications first.
Okay.
First question is, could we provide advice on broaching the subject of legacy gifts when this can be perceived as being a difficult topic, talking of certain demise? And I'll answer that first, and Caleb, please pipe in as well. When you have the opportunity to sit down in front of someone who has been a long-term supporter of your organization, however you define that, they care about the long-term success of your organization and what you're doing. And when you frame the conversation in terms of that long-term success and the long-term needs identified for expanding the scope of the organization, enjoying continuing success over the decades, it's fairly easy to talk about a legacy gift fitting into those long-term needs. And at that point, once you've got a legacy society set up to recognize people, simply popping the question saying, would you consider joining our legacy society since you've been such a long-term supporter? And it's fairly easy to do that. I think the difficult part is for you to get over your own discomfort around raising the topic. Certainly, the idea of death, one's own demise, whatever is in the background, it's rarely something that's front and center or even talked about explicitly. And most often when that comes up, it's the supporter her himself who raises that and is inviting you into a more intimate conversation. So I would say, look at your own fear first in raising this question. Practice it a few times with people that are close into the organization. You'll get more comfortable with it, and it'll be like second nature when you are having conversations with people to also raise the legacy question.
And Greg, and I agree with everything Greg said. I'm going to just add two additional thoughts. One is that my experience is that the reality is most people just have never thought about it. So if you ask them about whether this might be something they consider, you might not get an immediate response because, frankly, it's never occurred to them. So the notion about being focused around, as Greg said, the future of your organization and how they feel about strengthening its mission long term is really the heart of the conversation. And what you want to do is give somebody an opportunity to think and reflect and to ask questions about, if this is something you might be willing to consider, what kind of information might be helpful to you. That I think is really critically important first and foremost. The second, I'm going to say, very, very common question I get on this is, well, what if I talk to somebody and their answer is, no, I'm going to leave everything to my kids, okay? And that's a very, very classic response. And my comment will be two parts. One, I think many people offer that as a response as almost, if you forgive me, a knee-jerk response because they just haven't given any thought to the idea of giving back to an organization that they want to support or care for. And it's acceptable in our society, actually promoted the idea that we want to provide for our family and our children. And so it's an easy answer to give, especially for someone who just hasn't given the subject any thought. Now, what I will suggest, and it's a strategy that I've used quite successfully and effectively over time, is I will respond to someone who says that with a couple of thoughts. One, the idea of giving back to organizations that you care about is, in fact, a way to strengthen the very communities where your children or grandchildren live. So one of the powerful ways that you can actually include in providing for your children or grandchildren is to strengthen those causes that are dear to your heart and that make a difference in the world in which they live in. Secondly, I will say, often people who I've worked with who have chosen to create a legacy gift, though they want the bulk of their estate to go to family or friends, is because they also see it as an important means of expressing a value system to their children and grandchildren so that in passing on their life experience to their children and grandchildren, so too are they passing on the value of giving back, of taking some portion of what you have accumulated over life and supporting causes or organizations that are important. And I will say that in most cases, family members are not only appreciative, but they recognize the importance of what that organization or organizations meant to their parents or grandparents. So I think it's worth probing a little bit and just talking about some of the reasons why people choose to give back, even knowing that they obviously, for a variety of reasons, want to provide that most of their estate goes to their kids. Sorry, thanks,
I would add that you don't need to know all the answers before you begin having these conversations. The important thing is to go out and engage with people, and you'll learn from each and every conversation. Some of them may be major lessons, some of them may be minor. But don't think that you need to know the response to every question that comes up. And when you are a little bit miffed or uncertain, you can tell people that you'll get back to them, or if it's not that kind of a situation, you can think about what you'll do the next time out. And certainly these two scenarios that Caleb talks are two more detailed scenarios. Let's go to the next question, and it is, do you ever do a mailing about legacy giving? And boy, here is an absolutely very inexpensive way for any organization to promote legacy giving. And probably the most effective type of mailing in a legacy giving situation is what we call a testimonial mailing. And it's one person's story who has already stepped forward, has made a legacy commitment to your organization, in one-page letter letting your supporters, your other supporters, know why they've made this gift, in context, mission-focused, short, with a couple of attachments or enclosures. And one would be a description of your legacy society, once that you've set that up. And the second enclosure, which you can put on the backside of that legacy society description, would be sample bequest language. Very straightforward. Lots of organizations have done it. Really very cost-effective. Whether you're sending 50 or 100 or 1,000 of them out, whatever your budget will allow, most of the time organizations do these in-house, and of course larger organizations with larger quantities will use a vendor to send them out. But boy, the smaller ones, if the person who actually wrote the letter, quote unquote, or who you interviewed so you could write the letter, will hand sign them, well, boy, isn't that even a better approach? And if this person who is the signer of the letter, knowing some of the people that it's going to, is willing to put a handwritten PS in or a little note, well, that's even better. There's lots of things you can do. A second way that organizations promote legacy giving through the mail is in newsletters. And you can do those on your own. There are plan giving newsletters that are out there that companies, a handful of them, provide for you at a certain cost. That certainly is a good route to go as well. Caleb, you want to add anything before we go to the next?
No, that's great. Thanks, Greg.
Okay. Let's take a couple of the questions on designations. Let's see. Here's one. Daniela asks, what's the best practice for recording a simple beneficiary form, like a checking or savings account, in the fundraising software and accounting software? How does this differ if the charity is a contingent beneficiary? Caleb?
Oh, boy, that's a great question, and I need to be careful in my answer because my wife is an advancement services person and a Razor's Edge expert and would have a much more thoughtful response probably than I'm going to give. I'm going to say it varies tremendously from organization to organization, but I think the heart of your question really makes the point that most importantly what you want to do is think about how are you going to, in fact, track information about individuals who have indicated to you in one way or another that they've provided for your organization. So each system is going to vary, each organization is going to vary, but I would really strongly encourage, Danielle, and I appreciate your point, that what you want to do is give some thought to how are we going to capture that information over time. And doing it just not only so that there's an opportunity to do additional follow-up with those individuals, but also for stewardship purposes, acknowledgement purposes, and what have you. In terms of the question of contingent beneficiary, and again, this is a great question as well. Some organizations make the decision or choose to only recognize individuals where they are a primary beneficiary, either whether it's a beneficiary form asset, i.e. checking account or savings account, or primary beneficiary of a will or trust. Greg and I take a contrarian position on that, and our argument would be that you're really looking at building a lifelong relationship with your friends and supporters. So if they start by notifying you that, well, we've created our estate plan and everything's, going to my brother, say, but if my brother dies or predeceases us, then our estate is coming to your organization. I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. We really appreciate you thinking of us in that way, because what I see is that it presents an opportunity over time to say, would you think about including us as a primary beneficiary? And my experience is that over time, many people sort of make that progression in their thinking. So I would very much err on the side of being inclusive as opposed to exclusive. I am frankly horrified by organizations that I see that ask their legacy donors to jump through all kinds of hoops before they will allow them to be a member of the Legacy Society. I don't think that's good stewardship. I don't think that's building strong donor relationships. I want to treat people with respect and appreciation. So if someone says to me, I've made a provision for you in my will, or I've named you as a beneficiary of my life insurance policy, the first thing that comes to mind are two words: thank you. And I say that because at the end of the day, yes, there may be people who change their minds over time, or there may be that unusual crank who tells you they're doing something and then doesn't. But what I worry about is that if we make people jump through all kinds of hurdles and obstacles to prove that they've created a legacy gift for them, we're going to alienate far more individuals than we will have lost, or we'll lose many more people, if you will, than is worth it. So I would tend to very much operate on the inclusive notion of bringing everybody into the tent. I hope that's helpful.
Aside from the contingency part, when you look at recording a simple beneficiary form gift, you would do that in the fundraising software, but not in the accounting software. Only when the gift is received would the accounting side come into it. Our next question is, our regional quote-unquote community foundation provides administration and management help with legacy gifts for a 2% fee. We are thinking of placing our legacy and endowment with the foundation. We do not have a development staff person, and it also supports the foundation. Is this a good idea? Have others done it? It's done all over the country. There are just under, I think, 600 community foundations around the country, and they are here to help nonprofits, to do many things, but also to help nonprofits with their endowment, with their legacy programs, and so definitely check into that option.
Greg, I'm going to add to that and just say that I am an unabashed supporter of community foundations. I would wholeheartedly endorse organizations looking to partner with their local community foundation. They have terrific resources and assets and skills. Lots of very good reasons to work with community foundations, but one of the reasons, particularly in the legacy giving area, is that if you can partner with a local community foundation who can otherwise help and provide you perhaps with some of that technical expertise on unusual gifts or to play a role in helping manage your endowment, what does that really mean? Well, number one, it saves you time and money. Number two, it allows you to really spend your time where you should be, out talking with others about this form of philanthropy. I see too many organizations go through, frankly, a lot of headaches and hassle trying to figure out how to set up all the capacity, if you will, to manage these gifts when their time really would be much better spent getting out and creating them. So community foundations can be a terrific partner in this effort. There are other organizations as well that you can work with, but I applaud that thinking and would encourage others to do so as well.
Next question comes from Gil Fonger. What are some ways to, quote-unquote, celebrate those who have made a legacy commitment? Well, this plays to the area of stewardship. And boy, I think we've all heard of the 7 thank yous that people should get when they make a current gift. The same thing is true for those who step forward and let you know about their legacy giving commitment. So the first thing is, if you're the person who's that intention's been revealed to, well, probably a handwritten card happens right away. Then the formal letter from the executive director, perhaps, or maybe the president of the organization or chair of the board, whichever situation is appropriate. And then something annual, like a call from a volunteer who's also in your legacy giving group, is a great way to celebrate. Then you can move into the more formal ways of doing that, and they don't have to be expensive. You can have an annual gathering of the 5, 10, 20, or 500 people who have made legacy gift commitments to your organization, and the cost can be really modest. They can be hors d'oeuvres, or it can be a full meal. And with a small number of people, that's not going to cost much. In those situations where you have, if you will, an event, it's really important that mission is really reeking in the event. It's all mission-based. If you have in your program, there should be something that presents really clearly the mission of the organization, whether it's some of your program staff or whoever's appropriate. Those are great events. Some organizations, in addition to an annual event, decide that they're going to have something only for their legacy giving people a couple of times a year or 3 times a year. Also, if you are having other events, sending that invitation to your legacy supporters with a special cover note or letter inviting them to this event as a legacy giver is another great way to celebrate. Caleb, your thoughts?
I'm just going to add one point on that point you just made, Greg, and that I see all too frequently organizations that, if I can describe it this way, will actually silo their legacy giving stewardship efforts. So they create a legacy donor society, and then they set up a series of events or activities that are open only to their legacy society members. That's fine, but what I see as a tremendous opportunity that Greg just described is to make sure that your legacy society members are invited and involved in other celebratory events and activities of the organization. And I would do that not only because it's important to make them feel that they're apart from the organization, that they're actually part of the life of the organization, but I'm also going to suggest that by doing so and by acknowledging them at other events, you're reminding everybody else in the audience that this is another form of philanthropy that you might want to think about as well. So to the extent that you can include Silo Society members in the broad array of stewardship activities that your organization engages in, I would really encourage and applaud those efforts.
Okay, Caleb, we've got 6 questions remaining. 30 seconds each. I think we can get to each one of them. They're all addressing the issues of beneficiary forms, although this first one goes a little bit broader, and it's a little bit longer. These questions can be answered at the end of the presentation. Can you elaborate on the, quote, right to revoke beneficiary, unquote, in particular, most higher education institutions and healthcare organizations focus on irrevocable giving? Okay, that's kind of a long sentence. Do you encourage irrevocable gifts? If not, why? Secondly, can you discuss the use of life insurance policy as a plan-giving vehicle and the pros and cons and guidelines for promoting these vehicles to donors? We definitely think irrevocable gifts are great. They're fantastic. However, most organizations, I would say the vast majority of nonprofits, should have those be in the background and available if need be. And they should not be an excuse. Not having that knowledge on staff or those resources directly in your organization should not be an excuse to hold off on legacy giving. That's why we focus in this presentation so much on revocable gifts. Caleb said earlier that 80% or more of gifts to organizations are revocable. I would say in my experience, for most organizations, that number is closer to 95%. But let's not quibble that 15%. There's been an overemphasis on the irrevocable gifts. They're good to promote. If you need help, go to a consultant, a professional advisor, a community foundation, and get them to help you through that situation. Let's move on to the next question. Caleb, what happens to a beneficiary designation if the nonprofit ceases to exist?
Great question, and it will vary depending on the state where the person lives. It'll typically be governed by local trust or probate law. In the event where a gift is left to a charity that no longer exists, in many states it'll be the state attorney general who will step into the probate proceedings and make a recommendation to the court for what will happen to the distribution.
Next question. Do you have any statistics about the number of folks that complete a beneficiary form and change their will later? Well, we know from a couple of surveys done by formerly the National Committee on Planned Giving and now the Partnership for Philanthropic Planning that fully 90% of people do not change their legacy gift. We know that about wills. We don't know that about beneficiary forms specifically, but assuming that the same statistics hold true in general for wills and living trusts, we know that only 10% change a bequest in their will or living trust, and most often when they change it, it's to include another organization or increased amounts. So it's rare that people change their mind. Stewardship is really key. Caleb,
and Greg, just one other question or comment I'll make there. If you're thinking about your legacy giving program like you would your annual giving program, you know that you're bringing donors into your annual fund every year and you're going to do whatever you can to retain them, but you're going to lose some folks. So too are you going to lose some folks for a variety of reasons in the legacy giving area. But if you're taking a broad-based approach that's focused on easy vehicles, the end result is that you're going to be raising significantly greater dollars because you've reached more people.
3 more quick questions and answers. We'll go about a minute or 2 over. Please discuss the connection between a beneficiary direction of a simple form, a savings account, for example, and having to square that with a will that might designate other ratios for other beneficiaries. Simple answer here is that a beneficiary form trumps a will or trust, and if it ever goes to a contest, the form that the company has is going to trump whatever language is in the will or trust. Next question, Caleb, how will we know if a change in annuity has happened? I guess that's a change in a beneficiary designation.
You're not, because, and again, in all these cases, you would want the donor to have them alert you that they've created the beneficiary designation. And in many cases, they're not going to tell you that they've done it in the first place, and in many cases, they may not tell you if they change. Again, the notion is to get as many people to think about it as possible, and then to really engage in good, thoughtful stewardship activities to keep people in the fold over time.
Last question. This may seem very simple, but I am new to this area. If we are offering a beneficiary form for donors, where do we keep them? Who oversees them, etc.? And the simple answer is that you should have a file folder for each person who's made a legacy gift to your organization, and also a corresponding comment in the appropriate software that you've got so that you can refer either to the hard copy or that in your software. Thank you so much.
Greg, I'm just going to jump in and say that if we did not have an opportunity to get to your question, or if you have a follow-up question, or if maybe one of our answers wasn't clear, or you'd like further exploration, you'll see my email address and Greg's email address there. We certainly would welcome hearing from you and would be more than happy to talk with you if that would be helpful. We really, really appreciate your time today. We hope this will give you some additional food for thought about this important area of philanthropy. Colin?
Thank you very much, Caleb. And I just want to mention that our next event is going to be on February 9th on how to identify and talk with major donors. I'm going to go ahead now and bring up the survey. If you would, please, take just a few moments and fill this out. We really appreciate your feedback. This will recycle, so as many people as there are at your site can go ahead and give us your feedback. On behalf of AFP, I want to thank you for joining us today and all of your participation. I also want to thank our wonderful presenters, Caleb Rick and Greg Lasonde, for being with us today. And again, thank you very much for being here. We hope you have a great day. This does conclude today's session. To disconnect, you can simply hang up. Take care.